Welcome back to Hurtel Radio. I'm Andrew Donaldson, and get to talk to a guy who I've kind of come to rely on because he really knows what he's talking about on all this tech stuff that I'm trying to learn as I go on, and you probably are too. James Czerniawski, how are you, sir? Good to talk to you again.
Doing good. Thanks for having me.
Another Young Voices, almost said competitor, but we don't compete. It's friendly competition, but a Young Voices contributor and doing all kinds of good stuff in tech. And let's just go straight to that. Deep in the heart of Texas, there's been another legal thing apart from the other 25 legal things going on in Texas, the 230 bill that's been going on down there. People are kind of getting aware of what 230 is, but they still don't seem to know what it does. So talk about this Texas bill for folks and what's going on with it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting case. As you mentioned, Texas seems to be in the news a lot these days with different policies. But with this one, it was House Bill 20. And basically what it did was it created a way for Texas to go and be able to sue these platforms if they had gone and deplatformed the politicians, had some other interesting transparency requirements in there, etc. And this is just at face value, an unconstitutional piece of legislation that was signed into law throughout the course of the process. You had commentary from legislators and the governor himself even going and indicating that this was in part due to the political reasoning for like the censorship of conservatives by social media platforms. So they passed this law. Net Choice and CCIA had sued to go and enjoin it from get an injunction rather from it taking effect. And just recently, this past week, that was successful. So it got a full injunction. And basically, there's a lot of interesting things that came out of there because part of the reason that they passed this bill was that they viewed them as more of like a common carrier. And they thought that, well, if they're using algorithms, that was something that would go and make them more of a publisher as opposed to a platform. And this distinction is really irrelevant in the scheme of things. And the judge, like I said, in his full injunction, basically acknowledged that this law faces just pure constitutional concerns on the First Amendment. That's what granted the full injunction. And basically that it doesn't matter whether or not the decision to go and edit content or take it down was done by a human or an algorithm, that editorial discretion is something that is in fact protected by the First Amendment, and that whether it was done by a machine or a person, that editorial discretion is still in fact editorial discretion. And so nothing surprising there for people that follow this kind of lawsuit closely. But this is not the first time that we've seen this kind of bill pop up. While Florida and Texas did go and pass their variants, and both of them do have injunctions, lots of other states have looked to go and pass similar types of legislation.
Yeah, and because we get into there's so much terminology here. People talk about it being a free speech issue, a constitutional First Amendment speech issue. Break that down for folks, though, because they start getting into publisher, not a publisher, common carrier, all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Those terms are important because you can't just say something's free speech and you can't just say something is protected speech, because who you are, who's doing the speaking, where the speaking's coming from, that goes to liabilities and protections. And then that's where you get into the legal definitions, isn't it?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So when we're looking at, free speech, that's obviously something that's protected under the First Amendment of the Constitution. But notably, that is something that is a constraint on government's ability to go and limit your speech, not private actors' ability to limit your speech. And this is even something that we've seen historically when other lawsuits have been brought against these platforms for one reason or another, right? So typically, you'll hear that these platforms are the modern public square. Basically that they are the common area where everybody comes and talks about the issues of the day. And we saw this in a case called PragerU v. YouTube, where they argued that they were being censored because, YouTube was essentially putting this tag on them, and that because YouTube is this, modern public square, that they were being censored. And the court, threw them out of that too, because at the end of the day, these platforms are not public squares. Common carrier restrictions are things that we see normally on like our cell phone, companies and utility companies. But that kind of style of regulation does not even preclude those companies from having First Amendment rights, they would still be able to have that freedom of association. It would be a little bit narrower, but it wouldn't change the fact that they could still do a broad stroke of what they're able to do right now. It would just be underneath the First Amendment. So when we're looking at this issue, it's very interesting because all 230 is at its core is a procedural law to go and assign liability to who is responsible for the speech, right? So if I go and say something defamatory about you on Twitter, not that I would ever, but if I did, and you wanted to sue somebody, it doesn't make sense to sue Twitter. They were not the people who spoke the defamatory commentary about you. I was, so you should be suing me, not Twitter. And that's all 230 does, is make sure that, you know, a website or any website does not get overly litigated by these claims that, you know, this website hosted content, even though they were not the speaker of that content or the generator of that content.
And the thing that distinguishes these things from the public square is because you don't have to check that little box that everybody checks and nobody reads the fine print on. When you go into the public square, the content consents when you go onto these websites. That's part of what's going into. And then the other part of this that folks probably are now aware of, because Facebook is spending millions and millions of dollars to make sure everybody knows about this. 230 predates most of what we think of as the internet, and especially what we think of as social media, because it's an older law, but it's still applicable, isn't it? So when we see these ads from Facebook of I'm younger than 230, shouldn't it be regulated? That should kind of throw up red flags. It's like, well, wait a minute, the law's been good for this long and it predates. It's not just that it's old, it's what's actually in the law that matters here, isn't it?
Yeah. So I know that one of the popular lines of commentary typically is that, you know, we've seen with the Facebook papers and Frances Haugen, you know, she's claimed that, you know, Facebook doesn't want 230 changes, which would be quite an interesting use of precious company resources to spend a multi-million-dollar ad campaign advocating for 230 reform if you did not, in fact, want 230 reform. I think that, you know, there's reasons that those companies want it. That company wants it, and certain others would like to see that happen. But at the end of the day, the law, it's funny because people do like to say that it's old, 25 years. The internet was not the same as it was back then. All those things are true. But when they did 230, we have the authors of the text, both of them still alive, and it was very forward looking. It wasn't just about the internet of today, but they had a vision of the internet of tomorrow that could be broad and diverse. And this is still very true. I know that we think that there's just this vacuum of having Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, but the reality is that the broader internet ecosystem is far more diverse and far more competitive than that. And we see that across generations. So whereas like my grandparents would barely be having, you know, Facebook, I'm using Facebook, Twitter, Discord, a whole bunch of things to multi-home where I want to go and have my speech and what I'm doing. And then Gen Z makes me feel like a dinosaur because they're going and doing all that and then some. And that's really where we can see a lot of variety in what the internet houses. And it tailors to each individual person, which is what I think is the nice part about it. But none of it is possible if we don't have 230. If it's eliminated or if it's reformed, there are legitimate risks that those companies, in lieu of wanting to go and deal with any kind of litigation, would rather just not host that user-generated content at all, which would be terrible for a lot of people that I think have benefited from having this relatively open internet. If you just look at the number of people that have been able to make a living off of being on YouTube, being able to have their own channels and advertise and do like their video game reviews or whatever, that wouldn't be possible if we had more stringent liability. It would be limited for sure, and you'd have more gatekeepers, which means that I think that we would have a lot less speech overall, and that would be very unfortunate.
Since you brought it up, I know one of your areas of interest, and it keeps overlapping more and more into the tech stuff and the 230 stuff you talk to, but video games. You talk about the generation gap there a little bit. The thing is, the video game discourse doesn't seem to have anything creatively or new to it. It just seems to be regurgitated, because I'm old enough to remember when video games and MTV and rap music was going to ruin the country, and looking at how it is now as I enter my 40s, maybe they had a point, but I still think Tipper Gore was wrong, and I still think we should have some freedom, and I still think it's a parenting thing and not a government thing. But things like this legislation, this affects things like video games, because I don't know that people that don't game understand how integrated gaming is now to social media, to the internet. Twitch is one of the fastest growing political realms in the country. I don't think a lot of people that aren't on it even realize that that's where the kind of the bleeding edge on a lot of this stuff is. Talk about that. We also need to have these protections for gamers because they are really becoming their own little cultural and political scene, and they're rising and they're getting more and more attention. And they're going to have, I think, over the next 10, 15 years, you're going to see a lot of influence coming from those folks.
You're absolutely right, Andrew. The reality is that the video game industry has been one of the fastest growing over the past 10 years plus. And really during the pandemic, that accelerated by a significant margin, because with everybody being locked down and staying home, you had video game console purchases soaring. So a lot of people were really getting into video gaming on consoles that were not previously doing that. And that was actually great to see. But at the end of the day, video games are a conduit for people to express themselves, right? So going back to this user-generated content concept, if you're a streamer on Twitch, that is something where you're expressing your views. People are constantly putting in comments as you're streaming. And if we're going and doing reforms, that might make it more difficult for people to express themselves when they're either talking or when they're having comments in their thing. They might want to disable that because, like, for example, I'm trying to remember, oh yeah, this was in Australia where the court said, oh, you would be responsible for the comments on your Facebook pages. And this was to a news publisher. So how do you think that's going to go and affect free speech on the internet if your comment section can make you liable for things that are said there? You're probably going to like to turn off those comments. You're probably not going to let people comment on your things. You're probably going to be more, guarded in terms of what you're saying when you're talking about whatever. So that's just something I think that's always overlooked. Just think about any video game that's major right now. Call of Duty, that has a voice, chat function, right? That's still user generated content in its own way. And again, if you're imposing any kind of liability, it's something that I think with that internet function does make it more significantly difficult for people to express themselves digitally. And I think that would be a shame for the video game industry in particular, because one of the things that video games have done very well, especially with the iteration of the internet, is connecting people from all over the world to be, able to understand one another, to have new friendships that wouldn't be possible. Like, I wouldn't have half the friends that I have today without having this digital ecosystem that we have, whether through my gaming or through social media. Like, all of it is so intertwined that if we have any kind of significant changes, it would fundamentally alter the way that we would interact with each other moving forward. And that would be a shame.
It would. And interconnected people, when we're talking about things like information and freedom and diversity, all those things come from interconnecting people. So any way we can do that, we should probably protect it for the sake of liberty and freedom. James Czerniawski, you're fantastic, my friend. Let folks know where they can find you and follow you.
Yeah, you guys can always follow me on Twitter at JamesCZ19. I have a personal website at jamesczernowski.com where I go and post any of my latest writings and things of that nature. But always look forward to having a conversation with you, Andrew. Thank you for having me on.
And you can follow him at Twitter, which I do because it shortens down his name and it's just easier for me to type. But I always appreciate you, my friend. Great information. Thank you for your time. We'll have you back soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.